Good afternoon. I'm Brian Taylor. I'm the director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the fourth installment of the 31st UCLA Lake Arrowhead Symposium on Transit and Transition. The topic of today's session is Transit Now, which will focus on the actions and policies of the federal government and how they're affecting transit operators during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our speakers are Felicia James, Bruce Robinson, and Veronica Vanderpool from the Federal Transit Administration, as well as Doran Barnes from Foothill Transit here in Southern California. We will begin with 3 short presentations from our Federal Transit Administration speakers, followed by a response and commentary from Mr. Barnes. This will be followed by questions from the moderator and the audience. So be sure to add your questions to the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to answer them during the presentations. I'm going to introduce the 3 speakers now in order because they'll be speaking in turn. First is Veronica Vanderpool. She's the senior advisor to Nuria Fernandez, the FDA administrator, and is a member of the FDA team advancing policy objectives and goals of the Biden-Harris administration. Prior to joining the FDA, Ms. Vanderpool worked for 15 years in advocacy, policy, media communications, public outreach, coalition building, and issue campaigns. Next is Bruce Robinson, who is the Associate Administrator for FTA's Office of Program Management, where he oversees the Office of Transit Programs, the Office of Capital Project Management, and the Office of Grants Management and Guidance, which collectively administer the National Program of Capital and Operating System in Public Transit. And then is Felicia James, who's the Associate Administrator for FTA's Office of Planning and Environment, where she directs FTA activities relating to transit and transportation planning and the environment. Her office administers the National Program for Metropolitan Statewide Planning Processes, the Major Capital Grants Investment Program, and environmental programs and policies for all U.S. transit modes. So let me turn things over to the first speaker, Veronica Vanderpool.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Brian. On behalf of the Biden-Harris administration, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and FTA Administrator Nuria Fernandez, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Administrator Fernandez has mentioned how much she appreciated working with the research and academic community and so many others in California, and she sends her regards. The success of our public transportation systems is critical to the nation's economic health and sustainable future growth. Chances are you wanted to attend this session because you're interested in what's ahead for public transportation, including how transportation systems address the needs of everyone. And this is where public transportation takes a starring role, as well-run, accessible transit systems are the foundation of sustainable and equitable communities. As we talk about transit and transition, we need to address how the pandemic has accelerated trends already underway, such as the impacts of telework on ridership, and the emergence of new rideshare transit partners. Without a doubt, COVID has led to the most profound changes in travel behavior in our lifetimes. To address those effects and help the transit industry recover from COVID-19, FTA has provided critical support, and you'll hear about how today. In addition, FTA is preparing for what's ahead. And in any transportation future, most people would want and need a lot more transit, as well as the land uses it can support. That's because affordable transit that is also sustainable will involve more people sharing rides. While a small share of the population will be teleworking more, many more people are calling for affordable mobility and have jobs that cannot be done over Zoom. You'll also hear today about our efforts to prepare for a better and more equitable transit future. It is a new era, and under the Biden-Harris administration, we have opportunities we have never had before. The administration has asked us to drive economic development, to improve accessibility and equity, and to finally combat climate change. In my time today, I will cover how we at the U.S. Department of Transportation and our transit partners are responding to these goals. This is a pivotal time for public transportation as Congress is working to pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. As currently drafted, the IIJA includes $550 billion in new federal investment in America's infrastructure, including almost $90 billion for the transit industry. That is by far the most significant federal support for transit in our nation's history. And put simply, that means thousands of new buses, trains, and ferries, taking people to jobs and opportunities while we upgrade and maintain the transit assets we already have. The administration also has elevated the issue of equity and asked federal agencies to consider equity in all we do. The Federal Transit Administration is at the forefront, working to right the wrongs of past transportation decisions and supporting transit redesign and expansion. An extensive transit network creates better connections to jobs, schools, healthcare, and other destinations, and is a lifeline for those who don't own a car or do not drive. Many of FTA's discretionary programs this year contain opportunities for transit agencies to expand their systems. My colleagues will get into more detail about that in a moment. But overall, before we award any grants, we need to ask the hard questions about who is benefiting from an individual project to see how our investments can be leveraged to bring a positive return for everyone. In addition, FTA distributes billions of dollars every year to support transit construction projects. We know that small businesses and women and minority-owned businesses should play a larger role in planning, designing, building, and supplying products to more of these projects. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act includes support for planning, design, and construction of transit projects. We want those new opportunities to be enjoyed by everyone, regardless of the size of a business or who owns it. When US DOT grantees have well-run disadvantaged business enterprise programs, it can prevent discrimination from affecting decisions about who works on transit projects. That is why we are working to improve the department's DBE program. Last week, FTA held our first in a series of listening sessions to seek input from the industry on how we can do better. With what would be by far the most significant federal support for transit in our nation's history, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act would also finally offer an opportunity to combat climate change. Of course, the impacts of climate change can be seen everywhere. The devastating loss of life and damage from Hurricane Ida this summer, to Western forest fires, to epic flooding in the Midwest and elsewhere. Severe weather events now impact communities with record frequency. FTA is committed to leading efforts to combat climate change by ensuring communities have the fiscal and technical resources to convert to greener transit fleets and protect transit infrastructure. We also want to help reduce the impacts of climate change that fall disproportionately on poor and majority minority communities. The infrastructure legislation includes funding to invest in low and no emission vehicles. This will build upon the significant support for electrification nationwide by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions largely responsible for our warming planet. California has set ambitious goals with its state mandate for all transit bus fleets to be converted to zero emissions by 2040. California transit agencies have been competitive in receiving FTA low or no emission grants and are well on the way to converting their fleets. For example, AC Transit in Oakland opened its first hydrogen bus fueling facility back in 2002. Since then, AC Transit has added 13 fuel cell electric buses to the fleet and opened a second hydrogen fueling station. Antelope Valley Transit Authority north of Los Angeles set a goal of becoming the nation's first fully electric fleet by the end of 2021. That's just a few months away. And over the last few years has been buying up dozens of electric buses supported by a combination of state and federal grants. And the city of Arvin received FTA low-no funds in 2018 to support the city's bus program with new battery electric buses and charging stations, showing that we are supporting transit systems of all sizes in achieving their emission reduction goals. We look forward to providing new sources of funding to help transit agencies combat climate change. Another strategy is to encourage the use of green construction practices that help reduce greenhouse emissions. Looking at what we want our transportation systems to look like in the future must begin today. The changes transit agencies and the communities they serve have experienced during the pandemic provide an opportunity to reimagine transportation systems to ensure everyone has access to essential transportation services. I'm confident we can work together to meet the goals the administration has laid out for us. Thank you, and now I'll turn this over to my colleagues, Bruce Robinson, FTA's Associate Administrator for Project Management, and Felicia James, Associate Administrator for Planning and Environment. Thank you all for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Veronica. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk first about what FTA has been doing to help transit agencies respond to the pandemic, talk a little bit about some of our current programs and how we're adopting and adjusting some of our programs to reflect some of the new administration priorities that Veronica was just describing. If we look at our funding, traditionally FTA's budget is a little less than $13 billion a year, and that's largely for operations planning, capital projects for thousands of transit agencies across the country. But with COVID, we received almost $70 billion in funding, just mainly for operations themselves. And that was largely because of the drastic declines in ridership. Immediately after the pandemic started, we saw declines in ridership of almost 80% in some areas. Over time, that's increased. Right now, we're about 56% of levels, prior to the pandemic. And how this affected transit agencies varies. Some transit agencies are heavily reliant on fare revenues. So the steeper the decline in ridership, the steeper decline in revenues. Others may receive more of their revenues from local taxes, which may not have changed as much. But we started in response to the pandemic, we focused on, even before we received funding, was using some of our emergency relief provisions to help transit agencies. And then we received the funding in 3 separate bills from Congress to really help support transit agencies, keep their operations going and keep their transit workers employed and keep essential services running. So as I noted, the first things that we did were under the provisions of FTA's emergency relief program. And although that program is normally used to provide appropriated funding in response to major disasters such as the Hurricane Sandy up in New York or the Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria in Puerto Rico and Texas, it also allows us to permit transit agencies to use their existing formulas, funding that we provide under the urbanized area formula, the Section 5307, or the rural formula, the Section 5311 funds. We permitted them to use those funds for operating assistance, which is a major change because most large transit systems in large urbanized areas are not permitted to use FTA funding for operating assistance. They can only use the funds for capital assistance. We also waived the federal share, so we permitted the funds to be used at 100% federal share. And we also waived some of the other requirements related to our grant making, our processes and procedures, our rulemaking to provide administrative relief. Subsequent to that, Congress passed the CARES Act first, and that was in March 2020. They provided $25 billion. The vast majority of this went to the Urbanized Area Formula Program, over $22.7 billion, with $2.2 billion going for rural areas, including $30 million for tribal transit within that. Subsequent to that, in December of the past year, Congress provided an additional $14 billion under the CRISA Act, again to the urbanized area formula, the rural formula, but also to the enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities formula. And this is providing funding for services that help seniors, persons with disabilities, alternatives to transportation. A lot of this is done through nonprofit organizations, and those types of entities hadn't received funding through the previous bill. So to date, we've obligated over $31.7 billion of that funding, a pace that far exceeds what our normal pace is for obligating funds, and that just is in recognition of the need that was out there in the industry to support their immediate operating needs. The vast majority of these funds, particularly the CARES Act, I think about 90% 95% of the funds have been used for operating assistance. There's been some that's been used for capital. And as each bill has been passed, Congress has put more restrictions on the use of the funds. So with CRISA, recipients had to certify that they had not furloughed staff if they were going to use funds for something other than operating assistance. And really the design here was to ensure that the funds were being used to keep operations running for transit. Largely, if you think about it, the ridership, declined by up to 80%. The service didn't decline by 80%. The services, transit agencies continue to run largely because there's a large proportion of the population that relies on transit to get to work. And many of those were the essential workers that were, running grocery stores and doing all the things that those of us who could telework and didn't need to use transit still relied on that workforce. The third act, the American Rescue Plan Act, ARP, passed this past March, and that was another almost $30.5 billion to support the transit industry. And again, the large proportion of this was for the urbanized area program, but additional funds for rural areas, additional funds for public transportation on Indian reservations. Part of the rural funds are required to go to intercity bus operations in rural areas, but the Congress provided another $100 million above that to help those services. There's $1.675 billion for the capital investment grant program, $25 million for a competitive planning grant program that Felicia will discuss a little. And then there's $2.2 billion that we have a notice of funding opportunity out right now for urban and rural areas that require additional assistance. Now this $30 billion, we've already obligated almost $8 billion of that funding as well. This is just another way of looking at the funding to combining the three programs. Of the $69 billion, almost $62 billion is going through the urbanized area program, about $3 billion for rural areas. And you can see like the $1.67 billion for the capital investment grant projects. And those are projects that are already under construction. So it was to replace some of the local share that transit agencies would have had to put in towards those projects due to the decline in local revenues, as well as to help support projects in the future. To talk a little bit about what we have open and underway now, we have a number of our competitive programs. The Innovative Coordinated Access Mobility, this supports projects that will improve non-emergency medical transportation. It's $3.5 million, but it's not a large program, but it's more about demonstrating innovative solutions. Our largest competitive program is the Grants for Buses and Bus Facilities competitive program. And that's a little less than $410 million. And we're seeking applications right at this time. As I noted, there's the ARP Route Planning Restoration Program, that's $25 million. And then there's $2.2 billion for additional assistance for urban areas or rural areas who, even taking into account all the funds that were provided under CARES, CRISA, or ARP, maybe still require additional assistance based off of fair revenue declines and so forth. And then just recently, as Veronica noted, we announced the selection of projects for the FY21 Low or No Emission Vehicle Program. And then looking at how we're reviewing these programs or thinking about them as we're going forward, we issue competitive programs through what's called a Notice of Funding Opportunity. We publish that in the Federal Register and grants.gov. And within that, the projects, they describe how they meet the evaluation criteria. But we also have, we're looking at projects and you're trying to select between projects that are, highly recommended. We have what are called selection factors or criteria that we also take into account. And those are geared towards, supporting administration goals. There's the Justice 40 Initiative, which I'll come back to in a second. We asked them to look at how the projects might support climate change, by reducing emissions or planning, how they look at promoting planning and policies related to reducing barriers to opportunity and racial equity, as well as environmental justice. But the initiative, the one I'll focus on here is the Justice 40 initiative. And this is really an initiative that's across government, and it's geared towards ensuring that about 40% of the overall benefits of a program are helping disadvantaged communities. And Office of Management and Budget has been setting forth criteria on the Justice 40 initiative. The buses and bus facility and the low and no emission programs are two of the pilots government-wide. Since we had already completed the low no program, the buses and bus facilities program is really the first program that is being undertaken as part of the pilot. But as applicants are responding to the notice of funding opportunity, we're asking them to examine what types of disadvantaged communities their programs or these buses might assist. And the OMB provides kind of a broad definitions of disadvantage, from low income, racial ethnic segregation, places that have been discriminated against, particularly from government entities, distressed neighborhoods, communities with high transportation costs or low transportation access, communities with disproportionate environmental stressors. There's just some of the types of there. And then within the buses and bus facilities program, because this is a pilot, what we're really asking the applicants to do is to identify what they believe, how they would measure whether the benefits are being provided to disadvantaged communities and what types of metrics they would propose. And I think what we're hoping to get from the application submissions is, identifications of types of metrics that we might be able to use, more, across the program in the future. But as I said, that at this time it's a pilot. We'll see what types of responses we receive from the notice of funding opportunity. But this is just one way that we're able to adjust our program to reflect administrative priorities. So I'm going to show you this last is just some of our resources related to our programs. FJ's website is the transit.dot.gov. We do have a site specific to COVID-19 resources. We have hundreds of frequently asked questions that we developed in response to requests for administrative relief or questions about the program or best practices. And then we have information about our specific competitive grant programs as well. Now I'll turn it over to Felicia.
Bruce, this is Veronica. Felicia's computer just crashed, in fact. So it's coming back up slowly, but if you could start just rolling through her slides, and then she'll jump on.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, well, I will, I think I can start with at least the first slide because I am familiar with this. One of our competitive programs is the Route Planning Restoration Program as part of the ARP program. And as we were working with Congress on the bill, one of the considerations is, as we're looking for the transit of the future and considering what's happened during the pandemic, how do we design our transit systems to increase ridership and reduce travel times? And that's really the focus of this area. So it's looking at route planning, particularly on service that had been reduced, and ensuring that as we're planning for the future, that we're not just cutting routes, but we're looking at where to go. And some of the considerations, I think some of the things that we've learned during the pandemic is that we do have many riders that are reliant on transit, and many transit agencies, I think they already knew that, but I think it became even more evident after the fact that as ridership decreased, there was cords, and some transit agencies increased service on particular routes because those routes were still being heavily used, while they cut service on other routes that were less transit dependent. So that notice of funding opportunity was published in September, and applications are due in mid-November. The other program, and this has been an ongoing program, but it's the pilot program for transit-oriented development. It's funded about $10 million per year. It's really looking at transit-oriented development planning at station areas, in corridors where there are major infrastructure projects, and it's about supporting the TOD planning work within that areas. Early on, this program was a little bit undersubscribed. I think it took a little while to catch on, but in recent years, we've had more applications that had projects that we've been able to fund. But it can fund planning related to enhancing economic development and ridership, facilitating multimodal connectivity and accessibility, enabling mixed-use development, private sector participation, and so forth. So I encourage you, if you have, if you're thinking about station development, if you're thinking about work, taking a look at this program to see whether it can help your activities.
Bruce, I think Felicia may have joined now. Felicia?
Oh, yeah, I'm here.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. And thanks, Bruce, for continuing the slides along. I think where Bruce was headed was this slide just provides you a visual for the 90 projects we've covered for transit-oriented development across the country, and what we've awarded at a total of roughly about $80 million. You can go to the next slide, Bruce. So this slide here, I wanted to just kind of capture how even through the COVID pandemic, we've been able to see our capital investment grants program continue to move forward. Historically, this program receives anywhere between $2 to $2.3 billion a year in funding. And the funds are intended to support new transit expansion and capacity improvement projects throughout the country. Those projects do have to be focused on increasing ridership, expanding transit networks, and improving access to opportunities for its riders. Project sponsors do have to go through a multi-year, multi-step process as they work with FTA to get those projects through the pipeline. But we do see a lot of projects that do continue to advance. Since 2020 through 2021, up until today, we've awarded construction grants to 23 projects in 13 states, and another 48 projects are currently in the process of being planned. So this is really just intended to show you, just how we've continued to even through the hard times the transit industry has experienced, we've continued to advance major investments. Next slide. So here, again, another just visual for you on how the heart of the CIG program continues to beat along, just showing those projects I referenced earlier on the slide related to those 23 CIG grants and those 48 CIG projects that are in the pipeline. And then here is just a slide of projects just in the last year or so that have actually opened for service that were funded through the Capital Investment Grants Program. Just to give you an idea of just the diversity, we've got a number of BRTs, of course, throughout the country that have opened for service, as well as a streetcar and a heavy rail project out in San Jose, California. Next slide. And the last thing we wanted to just highlight for you all is how FTA is also trying to ensure that on the climate change and air quality side of the house, that we're also continuing to lean in this initiative. And the first thing I want to note is our greenhouse estimator tool that we did update back in April of this year. It's a tool that's really intended to help you through the NEPA process. Specifically, it allows you to assess how your project will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a tool. The tool is really set up for EAs, environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. But we also have a programmatic approach analysis way where you can also evaluate your categorical exclusion projects if you choose to do so. I also would be remiss if I did not mention our Sustainable Transit for a Healthy Planet Climate Challenge. This challenge was stood up earlier this year to help push towards meeting the Biden administration's ambitious greenhouse gas targets. As many of you all may be aware, our goal is to work towards achieving a 50 to 52% reduction from our 2005 levels to 2023 will be at 50 to 52%. And then of course, having getting to net zero emissions in 2050. We continue to make strides in this program. We do spend a lot of time investing in providing technical assistance to those transit agencies that have signed up for our challenge. To date, we have roughly about 117 transit agencies that have signed up as of yesterday. So as you can tell, there are many people who are looking for assistance or looking to figure out how they can further improve their climate action plans or sustainability plans or electrification plans that they have either already developed or looking to develop. FTA also put out on our climate change website a climate action plan template that is now available. And we do intend to highlight many of the success stories in this upcoming Earth Day in 2022. So I look forward to seeing who all we have that we can highlight during that time. The deadline for signing up for the challenge is the end of this month on the 29th, and you can find more information on the website link noted here on the slide. And with that, I will turn it back over to our host. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Veronica, Bruce, and Felicia for this this broad coverage of the federal role in transit in the last few years. We're now going to turn things over to Doran Barnes, who oversees Foothill Transit, their 38 route system. He manages private contractors that operate and maintain the agency's 360 buses, which is nearly one for each day of the year. And he leads the delivery of the service of over 15 million customers annually. So from the federal level up high down onto the ground where literally the rubber meets the road, we can hear from Doran is some comments on the federal program. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And I've struggled with my my bio a bit. The 15 million passenger level was pre-COVID, and I look forward to the day that we can get back to that. But it's great to be with everyone today and share some perspectives at the local level. Just for those that may not be familiar, Foothill Transit is the primary public transit operator in the eastern part of Los Angeles County. And in my years in this business, I've learned that every transit system is unique, has unique aspects and characteristics. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of our experience. The experience of other transit operators will be different, but I think some of the trends and threads will be consistent across the industry. It's certainly been an interesting time, and being here in LA County does shape a bit our experience. We are one of those transit systems that benefits from strong local support. There are 4 local sales tax measures that help fund and support our system. So that puts a little bit different economic situation for Foothill Transit and other Los Angeles operators compared to other parts of the country. There are some things that we've done in the last 2 years that I never ever thought in my 30+ career that I would see. I never thought that I would put forward a marketing campaign that said, please don't ride the bus. Didn't quite say, please don't ride the bus, but what it said was, we're here for essential trips. And if you have an essential trip, we're here for you. But if it's not an essential trip, again, consistent with the health orders overall, we told riders and told the community, hey, don't ride the bus if you don't need to. We're here for those essential trips. And again, I never thought I'd put a marketing campaign out that said, don't ride the bus. Along those same lines, I remember vividly, I got a phone call from one of our board members fairly early in the pandemic. And this particular board member said, why are you running all these empty buses, or mostly empty buses? And I said, if you see a bus that's mostly empty, that's a really good thing in light of a pandemic situation. Mostly empty bus means that we're providing physical distancing, that we're not filling a bus, we're not creating an unsafe health situation, and at the same time, we're able to get those riders, those essential riders that need to make those essential trips where they need to go. Bruce mentioned in his comments about the focus on those essential riders. And again, the pandemic has created an opportunity for us to really very keenly see who those essential riders are and the kinds of trips that they're taking. In the case of Foothill Transit, we found that about 50% of our riders were essential riders. They were working in medical facilities. They were traveling to medical facilities. They were working grocery stores. And we can all remember at various points where having staff there to put food on and essential items on the shelf was absolutely essential for all of us. And being able to provide those trips was incredibly important. Again, what we found were that about 50% of our riders were essential riders. What we also found is that a subcomponent of our ridership are express riders that travel from suburban Los Angeles into the city center. And if you think about the types of folks that make those trips and the type of work that they do, generally speaking, it aligns very well with a remote work type of environment. And so we've seen the ridership on our express routes drop to about 20% of the pre-COVID level. I don't know what's going to happen in the future with those riders and that ridership. I suspect that we're going to see those riders come back, but not riding at the same level of frequency as people have learned how to do virtual work and virtual activities and are making fewer journeys along those lines. So again, a very interesting aspect of how this all has unfolded. In terms of service, we made the decision early on to try to maintain as much service as we possibly could. Very early in the pandemic, we cut service back a little bit. If you recall, that it was all safer at home for a few weeks to get past this. Then things got a little better, and then we went back to more restrictive conditions. When things got better, we restored all of our service, and we've been running about 97% of our pre-pandemic service level. Again, carrying fewer riders, but carrying riders on those essential trips. And that was our primary driver. The secondary piece behind this is that it allowed us to work with our private contractors who operate the service for us to make sure that they were able to provide financial security and financial protection for the operators and mechanics and the service staff that deliver that service. And taking care of the workforce, again, a thread that we've heard about in the opening remarks and FTA's remarks, that for us was really important to be able to provide a level of financial security and ongoing support as we get through this difficult situation. That has served us well in that we've been able to not see the staffing shortages that have been seen in some sectors. And again, our experience is somewhat unique. Each transit system has had a slightly different approach to this, slightly different challenges, but the workforce is really, again, at the heart of this whole program. And I think the real key and the for us and for all of us in the industry, what has helped us get through all of this is the federal funding, the federal flexibility behind that funding to be able to make decisions thinking smartly about what the community needs and not reacting to a huge economic crisis. Again, some systems that rely more on fare box have had more economic challenges, but without that level of funding, we all would have been in absolute crisis management mode, and we haven't had to do that. We've been able to do things thoughtfully, trying to take in what's happening with the pandemic and being able to move forward. So we did some things early on, like moving to rear door boarding, again, to create physical distancing between the coach operator and the rider. That meant for us a loss of $15 million in fare revenue. Without funding and support, we could never have done that. Personal protective equipment is something that we've invested in quite heavily. And again, that's an element that was very, very important as we worked through the challenges of the pandemic. And now as we're moving into this next phase, again, the funding that is available with the flexibility is really allowing us to take the time to be thoughtful about what changes need to be made to the system, what happens as we move into the future, to try some new things. We're looking at some things related to our fare structure. We're looking at things related to our service structure. The ability to respond to the needs of the community, the funding that's been made available has been crucial to being able to get through that. We had a discussion with our leadership team yesterday, and I coined the term that we're in the pre-post-pandemic period, which in and of itself kind of sounds nuts, but I think it's the nature of where we are with this crisis and how we're trying to think about what's changing, what's different, how again do we best meet the needs of the community, and how do we focus on some of the other broader goals that have been outlined that are very important. We're looking at things like equitable delivery of service, equity in our fare structure, looking at how do we take advantage of this very, very unique opportunity in this very unique window in time to move some of these other initiatives forward that have always been important. But again, it gives us that extra window of flexibility, of opportunity, and to some extent of experimentation, smart experimentation, to figure out what really makes the most sense. Another area that we've been very focused on is the climate and particularly zero emission vehicles. Foothill Transit was the first to implement fast charge heavy duty electric buses back in 2010. We have one of the largest fleets of grid powered electric buses in the industry. What you see behind me is our Alexander Dennis electric double deck bus. That's the first electric double deck bus to be deployed in public transit service in North America. And we've just placed an order for 20 fuel cell electric buses. And I expect next week my board's actually going to expand that to 33. So the environment is important. How we're moving forward from a technology standpoint, again, incredibly important. None of that could happen without the support of the FTA and the US DOT in terms of being able to advance those things. Now, I will say that we're always looking for more resources to accelerate our program. We're going to be going very assertively after bus and bus facility funding and any other funding that will help us continue to move forward with our climate commitment. It's certainly been a challenging time. As I look back, we've been able to continue to move projects forward in light of and in spite of COVID, including our zero emission bus program. And I do think it's going to be a continued period of instability and learning. One of the last things, as I close my comments here, there's a third thing that I never thought I'd say in my career. And at least if you live here in LA County, I never thought I would say, please go out if you can afford it, please go out and buy an expensive car. And you might say, why would a transit guy say go buy a car? Well, just use it on the weekends or use it occasionally. But for us, as we look to the future, one of the key drivers is going to be sales tax revenue. Again, starting back with that, sales tax is a key funding element for us. When you look at the chip shortage and you look at what that's done in terms of vehicle sales, which is our biggest driver of sales tax revenue, again, a cloud out on the horizon. Not quite sure what that will look like. So flexibility is the key, and we'll continue to be flexible and move forward. So Brian, I'll close there for now, and look forward to the conversation here.
Okay, thanks very much. So what I'd like to do is ask all the speakers and Doran to keep the cameras on for this part of the session. I want to encourage the audience members that if you do have a question that you'd like to pose to any of the four speakers, you can put that in the Q&A function. And we will either select that question and ask it, or we can ask you to do it on camera. It's really your choice. Before we get to that, and I can see we have some questions backing up here. I did want to ask a general question of our federal folks, and that is, and I'm not going to ask you to speculate on what might happen in Congress over the next few weeks or months, for sure. If we were to go back 2 years and suddenly show you or show people in FTA and APTA the budgets that FTA has now, without knowing what had happened in between, that would be seen as sort of unambiguously good news for the transit industry. Of course, what's precipitated that is anything but. But I'm interested in how the FTA sort of has managed to shift from what is largely, especially in the big metros, an agency that focuses a lot on capital projects, especially in the biggest metros, to one that's being such a huge funder of operations. And Bruce mentioned that and showed some pretty amazing numbers there. And should things go, should both bills pass in Congress, I'm just wondering how you imagine a few years from now the FTA will look and operate that could be different than what it is now. So you've had this enormous shock and change, and potentially significant increases in revenues over the longer term. What has that meant for the FTA and its role, and how it's changing? And certainly, like everything, a big shift early on. But what do you imagine that playing out over the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years in terms of the FTA's role?
I can start and others can jump in. I think I would say that the almost $70 billion that we've provided in COVID-19 relief, I think we would, you view as the more short-term and medium-term response to the pandemic. And some transit agencies will use those funds over multiple years. Some of the very large agencies will use those funds up much sooner and much quicker. But when we look at, the potential for an IIJA, that's a much more capital intensive program. And it doesn't really change structurally the long-term funding mechanisms for FTA's transit program. So it still maintains, rural, small urban areas can use FTA funds for operating assistance at a 50% share, and large urban areas, large systems in large urban areas are not able to use those funds for operating assistance. I guess I would tie to that we've always permitted, or for the long term, we've permitted even those areas to use funds for preventive maintenance, which under general accounting principles is considered an operating expense, but we allow it as a capital expense in our program. So they have used some of their funds traditionally for some parts of their operations, but not, for paying, the drivers of vehicles and so forth. So I don't envision that, we're going to transition to a future where FTA is funding operations of these systems in the long term. I think the question will be is how far does the COVID funding go and last, and how does that compare to when transit recovers and ridership gets back up to pre-pandemic levels, and how close are those two related to each other?
Okay. They don't have to, but if Veronica or Felicia had a comment, I'd welcome as well, or I can just go to the next question.
Well, I'll just if I may, I'll just add that the reality is also that even with all that influx of money, we do still see a demand for those capital investments. So even though there's a lot of focus on the operational side, transit agencies are thinking about what they look like tomorrow and years ahead, and they want to be sure to be able to sustain themselves. And so you while you're focused on the operational immediate response, I think they're also still thinking forwardly on what they will look like in the future as their customers' travel patterns change.
Okay.
And I just want to add one
sure.
additional comment to this, because I think it's such an interesting discussion. And Brian, of course, you're not the only one who's asking this question about, future operations. And I think this very unique pandemic and this unique situation and pandemic funding from Congress really has highlighted how important sustaining operations has been in a way that for decades has not really been discussed in this funding forum before. So in support and in agreement with what my colleagues have said, at the very least, I think it has highlighted nationwide how important it has been for our funding partners in Congress to make the decision to support our transit agencies and why that's been so important to our economy. And having that nationwide discussion in support of that, I think, is incredibly important to note and highlight as so unique at this moment.
Okay. All right, and I want to get the audience members in, so I'm going to turn things right now to Jacob Wasserman, who is a research program manager, does a lot of his research on public transit, and he is helping to manage the Q&A for the group. So Jacob.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for coming. I have a question from Paul Gergis. Sorry if I got your last name wrong. It's about the pilot program for transit-oriented developments. And he asks, is there an emphasis or bonus points on applications that include mechanisms to decrease displacement around transit station area developments? And more generally, I'll add, how can funding incentivize such mechanisms to prevent displacement?
So I can, I'll try to definitely answer the first half of that. I think the best answer I can give is that the technical reviews they'll take into consideration the information that's provided in the application. And then from our perspective, that's a part of the strength of the work plan. So as you build in the application, those are the types of things that the stronger that those elements are built into the application, and then you'll see how successful the project is to move forward for future funding selection. And I didn't catch the latter half. Can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, just more broadly, how do you think that funding programs can help spur programs to prevent displacement around transit station areas?
Well, I mean, I think it's all in how you do the early planning, right? Like when you're early on in that planning process of figuring out how you're going to build out your project and what's happening around it, thinking about those things early and upfront, and what partners you need to ensure that the displacements are taken into consideration. There's equitable decision making across the project decision making process. I think you can definitely do that regardless of the grant program you're applying for, even if you're not using FTA funds, to ensure you have equitable transit oriented development built into your projects.
Okay, Jacob, we have, it looks like some other questions. You want to go to the next one?
Yeah, we have a question from Nicholas Deshays, who asks, aside from the transit-oriented development pilot, is the FTA doing anything to promote and fund cycling infrastructure, which has great potential in supporting transit service as a space-efficient first mile, last mile mode and a contributor to dense activity centers?
Right. I can start. We don't have a separate program that funds cycling infrastructure, but it is an eligible part of our programs as a capital expense if the infrastructure is within a 3-mile radius of a transit station. So it has to be geared, and that's what it's getting at here. If you're looking at a last mile mode, it has to be geared from getting someone to a transit station or from a transit station to someone else. So we can support the bike stations and facilities. We don't fund like a bike share, the program itself, but it's really geared towards using FTA funding for both. I mean, we're talking about cycling here, but also pedestrian access as well, as because we want people to get to our stations and to use transit efficiently.
Jacob, go ahead. I can see there's quite a few questions. I just want to.
Yeah, we have a question from Greer at UCLA next.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining the webinar and sharing your thoughts on this today. I was wondering, so Doran mentioned a few times that the flexibility of the funding amidst COVID was a huge help to the agency's ability to nimbly respond to the needs of the community. And so I'm wondering from the perspective of FTA, if this type of feedback will influence the way that you structure funding requirements in the future.
Yeah, I think it, I think we've learned, a lot from the pandemic within a variety of things. You think about, the future of work, how people are teleworking more. We've looked at how we change the work environment. I think the same thing applies to our transit programs. Normally with a reauthorization, which would be what the IIJ provides, is the opportunity when we look at our program requirements and when we update them. And I think that's the perfect time for us to be re-examining our program requirements, taking the lessons that we learned during the past 18 months, as well as obtaining input from the industry and determining are there requirements that we should change, adjust to reflect the current environment.
And Brian, if I could add a comment to that.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think as we looked at this period, there have been so many shocks to the system, to the transit systems in terms of what's happening. And fare revenue is just one of those. But if you look at fare revenue, and you look at changes in ridership, to me, it's absolutely unclear what that will look like in the future. At the same time, we're talking about access and equity, which has a revenue impact. So, in my mind, we as operators, we're always trying to balance our mission to provide mobility for the community and the realistic economics of how do you balance a budget to make all that happen. And I think as we look to the future, that's an area that we're going to, as an industry, all of us are going to have to be thinking about and leaning into really hard. Another area that I think, and it's clearly a priority, is leaning in on addressing climate change and going to zero emission technologies. We're all in on that. We have seen from a firsthand standpoint, though, that the benefits of zero emission technology don't come for free. And so again, I think this really has to be an industry-wide discussion with our key partners at FTA, as operators, other funding partners. What do all these changes mean? And how do we ultimately create a system going forward that has that financial viability and accomplishes the other goals we're trying to hit? And right now, I think it's all just clear as mud.
So if I could follow up with the panelists, that raises a broader question that we have generally in public policy, is that all of these rules and restrictions arise for a reason at one time or another. They pile up over time and can seem very bureaucratic and burdensome, but each one had a good rationale for being there. And I know that during the pandemic, a lot of those particular restrictions, even Title VI, I think was suspended for some time. And I'm wondering about, to tell the moderator and the audience, what were some of those restrictions that were eased that Doran might be very familiar with, but not all of our audience might? And how do you imagine whether some of those are going to remain at a state of higher degree of flexibility, or what you see phasing back in as we move out of the pandemic?
I think I would say that a lot of the rules and regulations, may have been deferred or delayed. So, for example, we had a requirement for transit agencies to put together safety plans. We delayed the effective date of implementation of that. We require, recipients related to the National Transit Database reporting. Normally they're supposed to, there are people out there counting passengers, right? So, well, that doesn't really make that much sense for them to be out there in person. They can suspend and change how they do that in response to the pandemic. So some of it was kind of public health aspects and trying to ensure that people could operate safely. Some of it was, just trying to be practical in terms of the NTD data itself. We knew we had huge declines in ridership. And so what we're permitting is, for example, is for transit agencies to use the data they reported in 2019 for the funds that we will portion in the fiscal year 2022 and 2023, rather than their service levels that they had in the last 2 years. And then I don't know that Title VI was suspended, but in terms of normally when there's changes in service, and there requires to be a service and fare equity analysis, and there was the understanding that everyone was cutting service. If this wasn't long term, not requiring entities to undertake that analysis in that short term, or with our capital investment grant projects that we're opening for revenue service, normally we require them to operate at certain levels for 5 years after the grant is awarded. Well, it didn't make sense for someone who was just opening up in FY21 to hold them accountable for projections they had made pre-pandemic in the first couple of years. So I think most of what we looked at was how ensuring that our regulations were reasonable in that environment, but it hasn't really looked at the long-term changes, which are more part of, as I was saying, is where we would be looking at those as we're going through reauthorization to see what should we be changing for transit of the future, not necessarily in response to the pandemic, but for where transit is heading and where we're trying to go with the administrative priorities.
Okay. Any other, Veronica, I don't want to, or Felicia, any other comment or? We can go to the next question. Oh, and one thing I would mention, and I did talk a little bit about that, some research that we've done at UCLA looked at Boston, Houston, and Los Angeles and how they redeployed over the pandemic. And in general, we found that as the geographic shift in demand to more low-income neighborhoods of color, we found that the bus service tended to shift in that direction. In a sense, got more equal, more equitable in terms of the relationship between the service and the ridership over time. So the operators were responding to the changes, and then generally in a way that shifted toward equity. Just as an aside on some research we've done. Okay, back to Jacob. We've got some more questions queued up, I believe.
Yeah, just a reminder to everybody, you can go in the Q&A window to submit questions. And if you want to ask your question on camera, I'll reach out to a few of you on the Zoom chat. So keep your eye on that. But we have a question from Abigail Rowan, who asks, the new pilot programs have a strong focus on equity and climate change, and it seems at this point it's on applicants to determine the metrics to measure such impacts. When will FDA have developed the criteria into guidelines around equity and climate change to facilitate submissions?
And I think that's what I was saying, that at this point, the program is a pilot, and really at this point we're trying to learn. So I think there's a couple things, particularly we're talking about the buses and bus facilities program or the low and no emission program. So we're talking about mobile assets, right? We're talking about buses who they don't necessarily stay in the same garage. They don't necessarily stay in the same route. So you can't necessarily tie like one bus and say, okay, this bus is going to provide this service to this individual population. So part of the questions I guess we're asking to transit agencies, how would you determine which populations or what would be some ways that we could measure which populations are served by if you're procuring 10 vehicles? And then the other side of that is what are the benefits? Because the benefits, it's not looking at what the dollar of the federal local investment it is, but what's the value of 10 40-foot buses? Are they providing improved safety if you're replacing old vehicles? Are they improving reliability and reducing your operational expenses? Are they reducing emissions? So we didn't want to try to pick at this point one or two metrics that we wanted everyone to try to answer. I think what we're trying to provide at this point is flexibility to transit agencies to identify what they think the benefits are and how they view that as helping disadvantaged populations. And then we can take that as lessons, but not trying to prescribe it or not trying to make our application process so complicated that disadvantaged communities wouldn't even want to apply because it's too hard to apply.
And Brian, from an operator standpoint, I think that level of flexibility is really critical. I had the honor of serving as the chief executive officer of Tulsa Transit in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the issues around equity and service delivery, the conversation in Tulsa is very different than the conversation in Southern California. So having a one size fits all across the country doesn't fit, because you have to look at those those nuances from a community standpoint in terms of what are those local issues, what are the local concerns, how is equity addressed, and what are the nuances that are required in each community to really get to those challenges.
And if I may add, I think that's why you've seen FTA put out different tools that you can use in this space, but not dictating necessarily how you would run the analysis or what analysis tool you would use and what the outcomes, how to assess those outcomes, and so that that flexibility can exist at the local level as you make decisions.
Jacob, another question?
Yeah, sort of building on your last response. Doran, what does community engagement look like for you? Because you mentioned that. And in particular, how does it look for an operator like Foothill where the service is contracted out, and so there's a mix of public and private? How does that affect your community engagement, especially when community engagement has been more difficult the past year and a half?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of structure, the way Foothill Transit is structured is we are a joint powers authority. The members of the Joint Powers Authority are 22 cities in the San Gabriel Valley and the County of Los Angeles. So the parent organization for Foothill Transit, if you will, is a pure public agency. I report to a board of directors that is made up of council members from the cities that are part of the Foothill Transit JPA. The delivery of service is conducted by private contractors, and we do contract that out. The contractors deliver the routes and schedules that we design, taking input and direction from our board and input from our community to actually implement that. So really the private side is more the execution of the service, the delivery of the service. The design and the public input pieces is driven from a public agency standpoint. For us, what we've seen is a big shift to various forms of digital communication and online tools. In the old days, the pre-pandemic days, we had a program called Meet the Planner, where our planners would literally go out to various bus stops. They'd pop up a little tent and they'd sit there for a couple of hours and talk to customers face to face. Well, in a pandemic world, you can't really do that. So our Meet the Planner events have now shifted to a virtual format. We do a lot on social media. That's not the only place to capture the community, but those are important channels to be able to interface with the community. And what we found is that by doing all of that, while it's different than it used to be, the level of feedback that we get is still very strong and very much helps shape the work that we're doing. I think a good example of that, and we haven't really talked a lot about the labor shortage that we're facing in the industry, but we're facing that, and we're actually, based on public feedback, we're going to be adjusting our schedules to make them more reliable, because what we've heard from our customers through these channels is that having the bus show up when we say it's going to show up is more important than having the bus show up very frequently, but sometimes not being there. So again, that feedback has been crucial in shaping what we're doing.
Great. We have our next question from Walter.
I have a question for Doran, or maybe from FTA, but choice riders, such as express commuters, should we still be pursuing them post-pandemic?
I'd say yes. I think we have to be pursuing all riders. From my standpoint, we need to be looking at where are the places that we can provide mobility options that allow people, particularly people, to get out of single occupant vehicles. Here in Los Angeles, any of us that have driven on any freeway at just about any hour of the day, when I see 10 to 12 lanes across packed with single occupant vehicles, I just think of the insanity of that from a transportation standpoint. What we're focused on is really trying to attract all riders, including the choice riders or riders that have other alternatives. If we can do things to better use our transportation network to speed up the transit system, to make transit attractive, I continue to be convinced that we can encourage some of those folks to take some of their trips and leave that car at home.
Thank you.
And I'd like to add to that. At Federal Transit Administration, we're in the business of promoting connectivity in communities through buses and rail use. And it's important for us to recognize that while the pandemic certainly highlighted the essential workers and the frontline workers who were most dependent on our system, there's so many other benefits to transit that we all recognize, right? People who use transit are often healthier. They're more mobile, right? They're pedestrians at the beginning and the end of their transit trips. Those who are using transit are saving more money compared to other modes of commutation, particularly in a single occupancy vehicle. So we want to continue to promote that mode shift, as Doran explained. We're not going to meet our nationwide climate change goals and our health goals and our equity goals if we don't continue to promote transit broadly. But I think there is a renewed attention and an improved attention to those individuals who have often not been best served by transit systems across the country. And that's been a very welcome silver lining, I think, to this discussion in this pandemic.
So I've got one more question I'd like to put out there. Actually, the whole group, if they have thoughts, and that is that prior to the pandemic, there was sort of a growing movement, especially among a number of transit and equity advocates, for fare free transit systems. And we know that the fare box recovery, for putting aside almost all of the capital expenses, the fare box recovery of systems range anywhere from 5 to 50% roughly. And so for some systems, fares before the pandemic were a huge share of their financial revenues for operations. And for others, it was relatively minor. And we also know that, for example, commuter rail systems, the typical rider comes from households with higher average incomes than the typical driver. While on local bus systems, the typical rider is considerably lower income than the typical rider. So that there's big differences in terms of the financial implications and also with the equity implications. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, because during the pandemic, suddenly fare free went from, hey, a couple places are trying it, to many suspended fare collection for a while. Some have resumed, some still made it optional. So it's a time of enormous transition around fare collection in general. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on moving forward, the role of fare free transit in transit policy.
I think transit agencies made a lot of decisions that they never anticipated making. And Doran talked about this when he said, essentially they were doing a campaign to encourage people not to ride transit. And of course, he said that really wasn't true. But I think that what it exposed is that this was a very unique situation for a unique population who were relying again on transit to get to and from. So transit agencies were recognizing that they were providing an essential service as well. They wanted to facilitate that. They wanted to make it easier to do so. So I think many transit systems, if not most across the country, did suspend fares, as we know. I think it is a very, transit agencies, of course, have to weigh their priorities against their budgets, but it's definitely a local decision. It's not something that FTA would weigh in on or comment on. But it's been interesting to see how some systems have applied that. We know LA Metro last month actually rolled out free fares for elementary and high school students and for those enrolled in community college. And it's a pilot program that's going to run about 2 years. It's going to cost LA Metro about $50 million. I think it also notes some initiatives and efforts that have been underway way before the pandemic from transit agencies that have been thinking about how to better provide service in a way that is more affordable for a lot of their users of the system. And many cities and many municipalities have rolled out sort of fair fare policies. And I think that's been an interesting endeavor that has helped encourage ridership, particularly amongst those who have limited or no incomes. And it forces, again, transit agencies to think creatively and not necessarily apply just a universal fare policy, but to think creatively about new fare service models and fare policy models too.
Brian, I
Or
think
others? Yeah.
you could do a whole session on this one. We could probably spend the next, well into the evening hour on this topic. Certainly been an interesting discussion, and being on the ground here in Los Angeles, we've been deeply involved in the fare-free conversations. I think from a pure economic standpoint, fare-free is challenging. When you really roll it all up here in Los Angeles County, and again, you can debate the number, but it gets close to $1 billion a year in cost when you carry that across all of the systems. And we have to keep in mind our riders and community members that have disabilities. We haven't talked about our complimentary paratransit programs. But if you're going to go free fare on a fixed route program, you have to look at free fare for that service as well. And as we know, those are very, very expensive. I think from an equity standpoint, in my mind, it gets really complicated really quick. We were doing rear door boarding, as many were, to create physical distancing between the operator and the riders. that essentially was a free fare system, if you will, because we weren't collecting fares at the fare box. Essentially, anybody could jump on board. Our job is to get people from all walks of life to the places they need to go. And then we're committed to doing that. But what we found when we went to rear door boarding and not charging fares was that we had a significant increase in people who were riding who weren't traveling to a destination. They were riding because the bus provided shelter. Issues surrounding homelessness are huge, complex issues that impact all parts of our community. But that's one of the unintended consequences that can come with a free fare program, at least in certain communities, definitely in our community. You have to ask yourself the question then, is it equitable if a person who is lower income rides the bus and then experiences the things that come with people that are facing other societal challenges, whether that's persons who are experiencing homelessness, persons who are experiencing hygiene issues, people who are experiencing mental health issues. Those are all the things that we wind up having to manage on an increased basis. So it's a really, really complex and important issue. Our focus has been to keep our fares low, keep them affordable. We're actually looking at lowering some fares, but not eliminating them completely.
Okay, let me turn things back to Jacob. Notice as well, we're going to drop in. We've been doing some research at UCLA on the challenge of transit and homelessness, and
Oh, great
had a
topic.
few
Yeah.
reports come out. We'll put some in the link. But let me turn things back over to Jacob.
Yeah, I had a question sort of about the medium term, I guess. So for now, it seems that there is a lot of money for operators, and who knows what it's going to be like in a decade, and if travel patterns change. My question is sort of, what planning are you doing at the operator level and at the federal level for the point at which the funds from the 3 stimulus bills are spent down? But perhaps, maybe not, ridership is still at a lower point than it used to be immediately pre-pandemic, which, as other research we've done has shown, was lower than it was in 2015. Yeah, so what kind of planning are you doing to avoid a cliff in a year or two?
I think from an operator standpoint, we're looking really at all the data points, and I think the struggle for all of us is moving quickly enough that you don't go off that cliff, but not moving so quickly that we disrupt the community and disrupt the people that are riding in a negative way. And what I mean by that is we've had a lot of conversations about, what do we do with our express service? We're still running 20% of pre-COVID ridership. We've trimmed it back a little bit. Do we trim it back more, or are we moving into a period where people are going to be spending more time traveling to work sites than they have been? I think I know that the federal funding is giving us a bit more flexibility and allowing us a bit more patience to try to figure out what that is. But there's no magic answer. I haven't found one.
And I think we're going to have to keep monitoring the situation over the next year. I think if we're the early summer, we thought, I think many people thought after Labor Day, a lot of more people would be returning to office buildings and be back in. Then we had a new variant of the COVID, and cases spiked higher than expected. Cases are trending back down. More and more people are getting vaccinated. So, what's the situation going to be like in January or June of 2022? And can we forecast from there what the future will be? I think it's hard to predict. I think we know that transit agencies are likely okay through 2022, 2023 for many of them. But I think that's what we're going to have to examine as we get into 2022. And as we're getting towards 2023, what is the situation?
Okay, Jacob, are there any more questions here before we have time for one more?
Yeah, we have one from Abigail, who asks, during the pandemic, operators warned a lot about serving transit-dependent populations. looking forward, what kind of improvements do you think Foothill would make, or more generally that the federal support would help to fund to particularly serve those who rely on transit as opposed to choice riders that we discussed earlier?
I think, from my standpoint, we've always looked to places that we can serve the community, and we can serve it in a way that works with a large size fixed route bus. And there are parts of the community where that just doesn't work. And that's not an issue of the demographics and the income level of the community. It's a function of, are there enough people riding the bus to make sense to have a bus there? We're constantly looking at that, and we've embarked upon a planning effort where we're looking at our entire system to see, are there places in the community that we're missing where we can add that? We want to serve all parts of the community in a way that fixed route makes sense. And I think we've also got to be looking at what other models are out there for parts of the community where fixed route doesn't make sense. That becomes, again, a somewhat complex question. It gets back to some of the regulations, the history, the funding patterns. They don't all necessarily lend themselves to new technology. But again, we've got to be looking at both of those things. Where does fixed route make sense? All parts of the community, and particularly communities that are economically challenged, communities of color. But also, what are the other modes that are out there? Now, that's a little bit of a partly unique answer from the Foothill Transit standpoint, in that we serve 77% of our service area are communities of color. So if you look at the diversity of our service area, it is phenomenally diverse. Our job is to figure out, where do we need to move people and do that.
Any other comments? Otherwise, I'm going to ask one more question here before we close out. We're not going to let you off the hook. And this is going to go, since Dorian had that one. There was one comment that was made. I can't remember which presentation it was, but it talked about how the FTA was trying to tie and encourage more climate action planning among transit, the claimants. Is that right? And it had the word encouraging, and I'm just wondering, because I know that a big part of the Biden agenda is a shift toward almost all areas of policy having connections to climate action planning. I wonder if we just have, we have 3 or 4 minutes, if you could say a bit more about what exactly you're doing on that front and what you anticipate that meaning for your claimants down the road.
Well, I think if you've been paying attention to many of the NOFOs that we've put out here recently, we're encouraging that to be incorporated into many of our discretionary grant programs, and for applicants to highlight how they're working towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions or other addressing climate change in other ways in their localities. The challenge itself is really intended to really give a concerted focus on assisting and providing providing the transit industry support and technical assistance in a way that's where it can be in a smaller group setting, one-on-one, particularly because we've seen, it's very different in how you address climate, whether if you're a large transit agency versus a mid-size or small, or if you're in urban or a rural area. And so how do we, with the challenge, we've been focused on how we customize that technical assistance in a way that we can, for folks who have signed up for it, where we can parse out addressing issues in a smaller discussion setting or peer exchange type of conversation, so that everyone understands how they play their part in moving towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's how, that's what we've really been focused on and driving that discussion forward. I think in the next year or so, our plan is to have more workshops, have more conversations, but also I think as we see whether this encouragement continues to get more people to the table going in that direction, how do we do more? What other things can FTA be helping them lean in on? We've seen through the climate challenge discussion, electrification became a big part of that conversation. And in that discussion, what came out of it with the industry was, the challenges that they see with the electric grid across the country, and how does FTA help facilitate or assist them in working through those issues that which are very complex and really somewhat outside of our wheelhouse. But at the same time, in order to convert your fleet, even if it's 50% of it to electric, you're going to have an impact on your local grid. And how do you balance that with the cost that comes with making that fleet conversion? So it's we've actually had some very good conversations. They've opened up even opened our eyes to some challenges that we weren't aware of that that the agencies would be facing. And I think the next couple of years we'll see us move more in that direction on even more as other issues are brought to light for FTA and how we can help facilitate more in this space.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I want to thank Veronica Vanderpool, Felicia James, Bruce Robinson, and Doran Barnes for spending this hour and a half with us this afternoon, talking about federal policy and what it means for public transit operations. I also want to thank the sponsor for our session, the UC Davis National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And I want to remind you that the next session is on transit's future. And that's going to include Professor Susan Shaheen from UC Berkeley and the San Francisco MTA Director, Jeffrey Tumlin. So that's coming up as our final session. And I, again, thank to all of you for joining us on this webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.